He had conquered markets and built towers, but none of that strength had taught him how to hold a child's hand. He came to the cemetery like a man in search of a language he had never learned. The marker was simple, a modest stone with a name he had learned to say too late. A single photograph under glass looked back at him. A girl with a crooked grin, hair tangled from sunlight, eyes that seemed to contain small storms and bright things. He kept thinking about the small moments he had missed, bedtime stories skipped for late flights, promises filed away under someday, the way a father can be present on paper but absent in the quiet of real life. He sat on the bench and let the city shrink into a dull buzz. For a long time he did not speak. When he did, it was in fragments, apologies that tasted like metal, confessions that had no receipts. Tears came and surprised him with their honesty. They were not for the cameras or the headlines. They were private disturbances, the kind that make a man take off his watch and set it beside him like an accusation. On the third dusk, a young woman stood at the iron fence. She wore a plain coat and watched him with an expression that mixed caution and familiarity. He did not recognize her at first, and then he saw the eyes, the same deep, quick eyes in the photograph. He felt the ground shift under a weight he could not balance. "You come here often," she said, in a voice that held no pity, only plain observation. "Yes," he answered. "I don't know how to stop." She smiled a small, rueful smile. Grief can become a habit. So can avoidance. Which is worse depends on the day. Her name was Mira, she said, but he learned soon that names were sometimes flexible things. She had a way of listening that did not try to fix him, only to contain him. He found himself telling her things he had not told his lawyers. The last argument he had missed, the toy he had not noticed, the memory of being late to the recital, and the way his daughter had waved as if the world had not been a stage. He began to come for reasons beyond mourning. The daily rituals of meetings and press releases felt smaller after standing in front of the stone. He cut a speech short to catch a bus. He canceled a dinner to sit on a bench and watch pigeons argue over breadcrumbs. The company noticed. The markets did not collapse. People assumed the changes were part of a strategy and moved on. Mira showed him the small things that make life livable. She taught him how to cup warm tea without thinking about who would notice, how to listen without calculating return on empathy, how to fold paper boats well enough to float. She told him stories about his daughter, how she used to teach stories to other children at the shelter, how she would fold tiny birds from magazine pages and press them into the hands of strangers who needed to believe in wonders. Slowly, gestures replaced press statements. He funded a reading corner at the shelter, but he insisted it carry no plaque, no cameras. He spent afternoons reading to children who had never seen his face on a billboard and learned to savor the way a child's concentration can be fiercer than any boardroom. He sat with parents and learned that presence can be more useful than money. Sometimes he would recall a board meeting and laugh at himself. The absurdity of a man who could move billions but could not move himself to a recital. He felt ridiculous and humbled in the same breath. He began to keep a different ledger. Days he showed up, small acts he remembered, moments when he did not speak as a chairman, but as a man whose hands were finally learning how to mend. Months passed, and the rhythm changed him. He still missed his daughter in ways that made his chest sharper than grief. The absence remained, but it sat beside new habits, appointments kept with the shelter. A Saturday morning he reserved for baking bread with a boy who liked to smear sugar on his teeth. People in the city noticed his shift and offered praise, then curiosity, then indifference. That, too, was a lesson about the world's attention. One evening, Mira arrived at the bench with a folded paper boat. It was creased and worn, the ink a child's hurried scrawl. He recognized the loops of the handwriting immediately. He touched it like a relic. She told him she had found it in the shelter fountain years ago and had kept it for the day when someone might need proof that a child's small things had weight. He placed the boat beside her picture as if it were a compass. "I wondered," she said quietly, "if you'd ever learn to hold something without wanting to name it after yourself." The sentence hit him with an odd tenderness. He had built so much in his name, wings, 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 and still wondered at the cost. He had been generous in ways that shone. He had been absent in the ways that mattered. Then she told him something he had not expected. "I was her friend," she said. "I used to come to the shelter to read, and she would bring the brightest stories. When she stopped coming, I kept reading for her." I kept a boat because it felt like keeping a promise. He had imagined the shelter's volunteers as a distant chorus in his life. Meeting someone who had actually loved his daughter without knowledge of his millions dissolved a part of his shame. The kindness had not been performed for him. It had been honest. They worked together after that, awkward and deliberate. He signed checks with hands that did not tremble, but he also arrived with a kettle and a folded scarf. He learned the names of the children's favorite cartoons and the volunteer who always burnt her toast. He fought less to control narrative and more to listen. His charity began to resemble something softer. Once, he remembered carrying her asleep in his arms from an airport lounge, a briefcase in one hand and a crumpled teddy in the other. He had laid him down on a hotel bed with the decisive motions of a man who could move empires and then gone back to meetings, thinking sleep could be prolonged with just a warmth in a room. Years later, he would replay that night and measure its quiet cruelty, the way absence lodges itself in the small betrayals. There was an evening when a tabloid called seeking comment about his missing daughter. He had rehearsed words that would protect the family and the brand, phrases that would smooth the jaggedness of public curiosity. Instead, when the reporter asked, "Do you regret anything?" something older than PR manuals moved through him, and he said, simply, "I regret that I mistook presence for productivity." The line spread through the feeds, and people praised him for having learned. That praise felt thin compare. Mira often challenged him gently. "Why do you give when cameras are off?" she asked once when they had walked past a donor plaque with his name gleaming. He looked at the reflection of his face in the polished metal and understood the question was not an accusation, but an invitation. He began to give time without counting the optics, to make small mistakes, and to accept that vulnerability was not a commodity to be traded. There was one afternoon when he attended a children's recital unannounced. He sat in the back, heart pounding, and watched a dozen small performers stumble through songs with all the earnestness of people who had never learned to hide their feelings. When a shy girl faltered on her line, he clapped as if his life depended on it. Afterward, a mother pointed to him and mouthed, "Thank you," as if his presence was proof that someone was listening. He realized that his attendance could be an act of permission. Late one night, he found an envelope tucked into his mailbox at the charity office. Inside was a scrap of paper with a line in his daughter's handwriting. The ink faded, but the message raw. "Don't forget how to be small." He pressed the paper to his chest and understood that the course correction he sought must be measured not in grand gestures, but in the daily courage to be less imposing and more available. People would later say that his daughter's death changed him. The truth was more complicated. It opened a door to things he had always known but had ignored. The value of presence, the weight of moments, the way ordinary kindness accumulates into a life. Mira helped him keep going, but the work was his. Grief had no quick fixes. It required him to be present when it was inconvenient, to answer a child's barrage of questions, to sit through small miracles without trying to make them investor-ready. One winter evening, when snow lay like a quiet promise across the city, he stood at the bench and listened to a child's laugh carry over the fence. He thought of what money couldn't buy. He also understood that the most precious thing he could give now was a steady presence, the kind that requires no press release, no photograph, just showing up and staying. He learned to carry missingness with open hands, softer patience.